Franz Boas was an intellectual of Jewish extraction. He came from Germany. He became very important in the early 20th century, and the reason he was important was because he was the father of a school of anthropology that essentially said that race was not important in explaining any differences between any groups of people. His descendants have been people who have pathologized any reference, any concept of race, racial differences, and so on. This is sort of a pillar of the intellectual left in the 20th century. And he's important because he founded this school. They became the heads of the departments of very important universities, so that by the mid-1920s, his students basically dominated the American Anthropological Association. They had a very clear ethnic political agenda, at least for the Jews among them. In other words, Franz Boas was not just a sort of intellectual pursuing truth or something like that. He well recognized that he had a very strong Jewish identity. That one of his main goals in life, one of his main purposes was to promote this intellectual perspective, which he thought would be important for combating anti-Semitism. He had the sort of rise of racial anti-Semitism culminating in the National Socialist movement in Germany. He viewed his ideology as combating that. He was also associated with far-left political organizations, and that's been typical, I think, of his disciples as you go down. He died in the late 1930s, but then his disciples effectively dominated anthropology down to the present.
It's classically portrayed as the nature versus nurture battle. In other words, the issue was environment or race at this point, and Boas and these people had decided that the important thing was environment, and they had to defeat the racist.
One of his big ideas was that you couldn't make generalizations about culture. You couldn't develop a theory, a universal theory of culture, because each culture was, incredibly unique, sort of beyond the pale of scientific generalizations. And prior to him, there was a sort of robust evolutionary theory of culture where you had these various grades of culture, beginning with hunter-gatherers, chiefdoms, nation-state societies, and so on. And the problem he had with that was that the people who were doing this viewed European culture as a pinnacle. And that to him was anathema. He was a strongly identified Jew. He viewed the Prussian culture of his childhood as very dangerous. He had very negative memories of that, very negative attitudes about that culture. And I think that's sort of the common denominator, I think, of all these Jewish intellectual movements that we'll talk about, is this underlying, hostility, distrust, this deep historical memory of the negative things that have happened to Jews in European culture. So when he thinks of the Prussian culture of Germany, he doesn't think of cathedrals and kings and leaders. He thinks of that there were elements of anti-Semitism there, that it was a Christian culture, that Christians have oppressed Jews over the centuries. So for him, these cultures were not the pinnacle of civilization. They weren't the pinnacle of science or anything. And so as an attempt to deconstruct culture, this is the origin of the sort of cultural relativist movement, that all cultures are sort of equal. There's no way to grade them in terms of even of their technical accomplishments or anything. He had famous disciples, Margaret Mead.
She was the person who, under Boas's direction, went to Samoa, did a study of the natives in Samoa, and came back and said that basically Sturm und Drang, storm and stress, they got it from Schiller, but since psychology was German, they were using terms like this. Sturm und Drang during adolescence is only a cultural phenomenon. It's only in America. It's all the result of Christianity. If we eliminate all of these Christian sexual prohibitions, there will be no stress in society. And as proof of that, look at the people in Samoa. Well, the fact of the matter is that it became apparent after the publication of Derek Freeman's book, Margaret Mead in Samoa, an Australian anthropologist. It became apparent that Margaret Mead made it all up. It was one of the biggest instances of academic fraud in the 20th century. She didn't speak Samoan. Freeman says she was just put on by Samoan girls who would giggle and tell jokes and make fun of the round eye or whatever they call these white people in Samoa. And she overlooked a significant part of Samoan culture, which was basically a digital rape. was part of Samoan culture. Didn't get mentioned at all. There were also, you know, if the Samoan man sits under a palm tree with his, the guy's sister, the guy beats up the guy. You can't do that with my sister. And so on and so forth. In other words, it was made up. It was what we would call Blue Lagoon anthropology, based on, you know, the Blue Lagoon movie with Brooke Shields. It's basically, it's like the plot of Lord of the Flies. The plane is flying. It crashes on this tropical island in the Pacific, and suddenly, hey, all bets are off. Because all of that stuff you believed was the moral law, that's all bourgeois morality. There's no bourgeoisie here. So morality doesn't have any force anymore, and we can all live like, you know, free and wonderful people. The French had this fantasy. Rousseau was probably the main proponent of it with his idea of the noble savage. And now it caught on in America as a way of undermining the whole idea that there was a Christian morality that should be normative for this country.
So it was a mythology, but it was a very effective mythology. Margaret Mead essentially created a mythical anthropology that was accepted as gospel. Again, her writings aren't very important except for the fact that they were promoted and became intellectual gospel. To the point that even after she was debunked and was shown to be a myth, and shown to be false, shown to be either lies or misinformation, that she is still ionized, and people were horrified that she was, her reputation would be called into question. So it's a very powerful thing that anybody who disagrees with all this is up against. It's got a huge inertia at this point. It's very hard to change. These things take on a life of their own. It's a matter of promotion. It's not a matter of truth or reality. It's a matter of leading a movement that has an influence. And so the influence comes not so much from the original person, but from the infrastructure, the publishing houses, the media, the professors in universities who assign Margaret Mead as part of their courses. You know, this is where it achieves a life of its own, and it is seen as true, it is seen as science, it is seen as inviolably correct. And I think the concept of race is very respectable. But still, the concept of race is profoundly controversial. So this is the legacy of that, and we still see that in the present, because people like Philippe Rushton at the University of Western Ontario in Canada, Richard Lynn, their analyses of racial differences in intelligence in different peoples of the world is the exact sort of thing that is anathema to the Boasian school, and that continues with us today, because the writings of people like Rushton and Lynn are marginalized. They're not talked about. If they're ever mentioned in the newspapers, they tend to be qualified. You'll bring in all these other people who say that's nonsense. You can't even give the concept of intelligence doesn't make any sense. There is no such thing as race, etc. You know, so it remains problematic to this day. The transformation of the universities in the United States in the direction of political correctness, a lot of that has to be laid at the foot of Franz Boas.